The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the suburban streets as John neared the end of his commute. After hours in the office, the hum of his SUV brought him a strange comfort, familiar, predictable, just like the endless routine of meetings and reports he'd left behind. He passed the empty playground where he had once pushed his kids on the swings. Now that they were in high school, the time they used to spend with him had given way to the pull of friends and new interests, leaving him to reflect on how quietly time had slipped by. John turned onto the familiar two-lane road, now reduced to a single, narrow stretch. Construction had dragged on for months, leaving half the road blocked by cones and rusting equipment. There was only room for one car to pass at a time, and he could only hope to avoid the awkward standoff the bottleneck always seemed to create. Just then, a flash of red appeared in the distance. A sleek muscle car, its engine roaring as it closed in. It moved fast, the deep rumble of the exhaust breaking the stillness of the summer air. Through the glare on the windshield, John could just make out the face of a young man behind the wheel, barely 20. John knew he had the right of way, but the red car continued accelerating, showing no signs of slowing. After a moment of deliberation, John sighed and eased the car to the side, letting the red blur roar past him. John waited until the red car vanished over the horizon, then eased back onto the lane. The road stretched quietly ahead, with only the soft hum of his engine breaking the stillness. Now, you probably feel bad for John. He's a hard-working family man just trying to get home after a long day at the office and he has to yield to some brat. We sympathize with John. We grumble right along with him about the selfish youth. But what if I told you that this scenario actually played out exactly the way it should have? That this was the most optimal outcome? You see, this scenario is actually a real-world example of the game of chicken. The game takes many forms, but the basic idea behind it is that two players are heading towards a conflict, and the one who backs down first is seen as the chicken.
I am the king of gay chickens!
However, if neither backs down, both sides face consequences far worse than just losing some clout. The game is all about seeing who's more willing to risk suffering the worst possible outcome. In John's situation, we can model all the possible outcomes with something called a payoff table. This table just shows how satisfied or dissatisfied John is with each result of the game. The first scenario is that John speeds through while the young man swerves. This is the best possible outcome for John. He gets to go first and keep his schedule and pride intact. The second scenario is the reverse, where John swerves while the young man speeds through. John's understandably upset that he's having to yield to his foe and delay his commute ever so slightly longer, but he'll forget about it in a few hours. The third outcome is both John and the young man swerve, which we're going to consider a neutral outcome, as we're still stuck in the same dilemma. The fourth and final outcome is both John and the young man try to speed through at the same time and crash. Obviously, we don't want to die driving home from work, but do we really want to yield every single time we're in this situation? The key to this whole problem is that our best outcome hinges on what our opponent does. If we could read minds, this problem would be trivial. If we knew for certain they were going to keep speeding, we'd always choose to yield. And if we knew they were going to yield, we'd always keep speeding. It's the uncertainty that makes this problem so interesting. And since we're not clairvoyant, we instead do the next best thing. We look for signals. As the name suggests, signaling is the information players give off, whether on purpose or not, about their intentions or character. These signals help us size up our opponent and understand them, all without ever meeting or even speaking a word to them. Let's look at John. He's driving a reliable, budget-friendly SUV, and he's following the speed limit. These choices, his car, his cautious driving, signal that he's a family man, likely middle-aged, with fewer raging hormones and a lower risk tolerance. The young man, by contrast, is flying down the road in a scat pack. He's had the muffler removed to ensure his presence is heard across the metroplex. He knows that red cars are most likely to be pulled over by the police and doesn't care. All of these were conscious decisions that intuitively signal to others bravado, higher risk tolerance, and a need to assert dominance. And from these signals, we can also infer a lot about each driver's likely decisions. Younger people, particularly young men driving sports cars, tend to take more risks. Insurance companies have built a $1 trillion industry around estimating just how risky people are. On the other hand, John's vehicle, a practical family SUV, suggests that he's more focused on his monthly mortgage payments than on racing for his pride. So during their encounter, both drivers, consciously or not, read these signals. John, being more risk-averse, makes the logical choice to yield, avoiding a crash, The young man, sensing John's low tolerance for danger, speeds through, confident that he won't have to stop. Alright, so problem solved. Our two drivers have reached an equilibrium. Except this logic isn't foolproof. For all John knows, the Pope could be in that muscle car. And as far as the young man knows, Attila the Hun might just like the gas mileage on his SUV. It turns out that the stereotypes drawn from conclusions aren't always accurate. Anytime we're trying to predict something, there is inevitable room for error. What we really care about is making choices that have the greatest expected value. And by that, I mean the best possible outcome, factoring in how likely it is to happen. For example, working at McDonald's has a higher expected value than playing the lottery. You're guaranteed to get paid at McDonald's, while the odds of winning the lottery are almost non-existent. Okay, so what are the expected values for each of John's outcomes? Well, it turns out it's hard to solve for them when all we have is emojis. Earlier I used emojis to simplify the concept of payoff tables, but it turns out scientists don't use stickers to signify outcomes. They assign numbers. In our case, we're going to assume that the higher the number, the happier the person, and vice versa. These numbers are arbitrary, what really matters is their proportion to each other. Let's go back to our payoff table from before. We'll assign the number 10 to outcome 1, where John gets his way and gets to go first. For outcome 2, where John has to yield, we'll give him a 2. Outcome 3, a compromise, gets a 5. And finally outcome 4, crashing and dying, will be negative 1,000. Assigning numerical values to each of these outcomes is extremely useful because it lets us use math to determine which choice has the highest expected outcome. Specifically, it lets us calculate John's tipping point. This is the probability John needs to believe the young man will swerve to make both choices feel equally worthwhile. For example, if John thinks there's a 40% chance the young man will speed through, he might consider holding his ground. But based on the math, John would actually need to believe there is a 99.5% chance the young man will swerve to make it worth the risk of not swerving himself. This super high tipping point means John has to feel almost certain the young man will back down, or else the risk of crashing is just too high to ignore. And from what we know so far about John, this makes sense. To risk a crash and potentially your life when you have bills to pay and a family to provide for seems ridiculous. But if that's the case, why would anyone ever risk it? Surely even the boldest rebel wouldn't be that certain John won't speed through, right? Here's where things get interesting. We're currently looking at John's and only John's payoff table. These expected values, the minimal gain from going first and the extreme aversion to crashing, are unique to him. But everyone's different. What if the young man is here for a good time and not a long time? To some, there are worse things than death. Based on what we know about the young man, let's say his payoff table looks something like this. Now, going first gives him more thrill, he dislikes yielding even more, and he's relatively indifferent to crashing. With these expected values, he'd only need to be about 45% sure that John will yield for speeding through to make sense. And based on John's signals, that's a pretty likely bet. It seems crazy to think that risking your life could be the right choice, but the truth is that we're making decisions like this every day. Every choice, no matter how small, involves some risk. Driving to work instead of taking the bus has a higher risk of death. Eating sugary foods, same thing. Hell, even prolonged sitting statistically increases your mortality rate over time. We're constantly making decisions that balance risk and reward. In that sense, we're all a little like the young man. So as the young man and John drive their separate ways on a warm summer evening, we better understand why each chose the path they did, and how surprisingly complex seemingly mundane encounters like this are. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time.